let's start. It's quite early.
I'm fine.
Early in the morning, but we have to proceed. Yeah, this morning session we entitled "The Legacy of Bronisław Malinowski's Anthropology," but not, in fact, not only anthropology. And our first presenter, Patrick Burke,
I need to
from the University of Westminster, will speak about making sense of Malinowski as an ancestor. But in his case, this is a real ancestor, not in figurative meaning.
And the first is
yeah, that one. Just getting the slides up. Turn this on.
Here you go, you can use the mouse to change the size.
Okay. Oh, it's a bit fuzzy. A bit fuzzy, that photograph. But okay, so yes, this is going to be a bit different. I'm going to be talking about family history, family memories. Oops. So, Bronisław Malinowski and Elsie Masson Malinowska had 3 daughters, Józefa, Wanda, and Helena. Helena was my mother. There were 10 grandchildren, some of whom I list here, and I'll be talking or referring to the first 3, Józefa's children, and to myself and to my sister Lucy, Helena's children, in this talk. I won't be talking about Wanda. I'll say right now why there isn't enough evidence of different kinds that I have had access to be able to say anything useful about Wanda and her family on this topic. And there were 6 great-grandchildren, one of whom, Zachary Stewart, features also in this talk. So, so the making sense then that I'll be talking about is of Malinowski and Elsie too as grandparents, Malinowski as a husband, as a father, as a grandfather, even a great-grandfather. I won't be talking about what his descendants may or may not think or have said about Malinowski, the anthropologist. None of us is an anthropologist, and so that is not relevant here. I find it quite challenging to write this in some ways, partly, I think, for reasons that are common to anyone doing historical or biographical research. There's different amounts of evidence available, and it's of different qualities. People contradict each other. Some people are dead and have never recorded any of their views about the subject matter. On top of that, there's the fact that I'm involved in this. I'm a descendant, I have a view, but I'm also trying to interpret what other members of my family have said or written about Malinowski and Elsie. I put up here some of the sources, all published, that I've drawn on. The documentary that my cousin, a great-grandson, Zachary Stewart, co-directed, Savage Memory, in which covers the legacy of Malinowski for anthropology, Trobrians, and the family. I think the final strand is the most interesting, certainly is to me. A memoir, What Wasn't I Thinking, by a cousin of mine, recently published, an American cousin, and then the story of a marriage, the correspondence between Elsie and Malinowski, edited by my mother, and then to represent 2 pieces that she wrote, one about the role of women in Malinowski's life and their influence on his work, the JSO image, and then a piece she wrote about Malinowski, about Polishness or the lack of Polishness in my mother's childhood. On top of that, I've drawn on private conversations and, of course, on people's memories, including my own. So the obvious place to start is with, that isn't moving. Okay. Right. Yeah. The obvious place to start is with the documentary Savage Memory. And I probably wouldn't be giving this talk if it hadn't been made. And in doing that, I'll be talking mainly about what the Stuart family, so the children and the grandchild of Józefa, have said about Malinowski. The documentary explores the claim that Malinowski behaved with, in some versions, extreme selfishness towards his wife and his daughters, and that he neglected, even abandoned them, and that this damaged the daughters and through them their children, perhaps even their grandchildren. And he behaved in this way because his career was more important to him than his family. Zachary Stewart, who narrates the documentary, summarizes these views with this, quote, "There are those in my family who think that my great-grandfather's legacy has crippled all of the following generations." My cousin, a grandchild, Sebastian Stewart, says this, and despite the factual inaccuracies in this statement, its core meaning is still clear. There were 3 daughters. Their mother got sick with multiple sclerosis. That was true. Malinowski bought a house in northern Italy, put the 3 daughters there with their dying mother, and went off to pursue his career. That sums up, I think, certainly what he thinks. And Rebecca, a cousin, has said he, Malinowski, was a very distant figure to all 3 daughters because he wasn't there. They never actually had the man as a father. He was a father figure. So this neglect and abandonment of his wife and his daughters in this account left the girls, the daughters, feeling undervalued, unappreciated, according to David, a cousin, who actually presents this behavior also as an expression of what he sees as Malinowski's attitude to women as a whole. Quote, "He treated women badly. He didn't value women for their intellectual capacity." So fast forward to 1942, Malinowski dies suddenly. His second wife, Elsie, having died in 1935, his second wife, Valletta Swan, leaves for Mexico City, and the 3 daughters are now in the United States and, as it were, alone, finally completely abandoned. And the way they dealt with this, David says, is to assert the only thing they had, their intellects and their status, as the children of a great man. Only in this way could the 3 daughters create a sense of security and belonging for themselves. In his memoir, What Wasn't I Thinking?, Sebastian writes that being Malinowski's daughter was not just a key component of Józefa's identity, it gave her a sense of superiority. Though she could describe, or would describe, Malinowski, I'm quoting, as an arrogant shit, who could be cold and cutting as ice and had little time for his daughters, she also wrapped herself in his reflected glory. He gave her cachet, an aura of intellectual superiority. In a somewhat kinder tone, he writes that his aunt, Helena, my mother, was terribly bright in that Malinowski way that let you know that she knew it. Okay, so this sense of superiority, sorry, can you, yeah, oh, I can do that, right. Oh, sorry, I meant to go forward and I forgot. Anyway, there's that. Right, this sense of superiority, which derived from being a daughter of Malinowski, is the essence of the burden that, according to this account, Malinowski has placed on his descendants. It is the Malinowski curse, to use a phrase that the Stewart grandchildren used in the documentary. In Sebastian's word, this curse is a lot of intelligence and no common sense, coupled with an unearned, condescending grandiosity overlaid over a crippling insecurity. More succinctly, it's being arrogant, being a know-it-all. David then says, family dynamics reproduce generation after generation. And so the curse has been passed down by the daughters to the next generation. David, I've been a know-it-all all my life. And Rebecca, I think David has the worst of the Malinowski curse and I'm second. He's a bigger know-it-all than I am. But for one descendant, that's Sebastian, there is another Malinowski curse. It overlaps with the first, what I've just described, but it's different. In his memoir, Sebastian tells us that he came to see that it was Elsie, not Bronio, who was the linchpin in our family story. It was Elsie's gruesome death over 11 long years and its effect on the daughters as they watched her decline that did damage first to them and then to their children. And this was coupled in its impact with Malinowski's being gone for long stretches and when he was around, having little time for his daughters. The pain of watching Elsie die a slow and agonizing death was compounded by the fact that after Elsie's death, the daughters never talked about this trauma. They just stuffed it down, and they're still stuffing it down. He quotes actually his cousin Tina, my cousin Tina, one of Vanda's children here. Józefa said nothing about Elsie in Sebastian's childhood. He never mentioned her, quote, Australian mother, Elsie Masson Malinowski, he calls her, not Malinowska. So this slow wasting away and the death from multiple sclerosis was such a painful memory that Józefa could not bear to discuss her mother. And the repression of this pain has had a destructive effect on the next generation. This curse has been much worse than the mere know-it-allness, the arrogance of the other version. It played a role in Sebastian's own self-destructive behavior and roiling insecurity, and in the schizophrenia, drug abuse, disturbing fits, and zero impulse control of other members of the extended family. Quote, Elsie's illness generated monster waves that swamped, to one extent or another, her children and her grandchildren. How much time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So I want to, having briefly outlined how the Stuart children, my first cousins, grandchildren of Malinowski, have how they interpret Malinowski and his impact on the family and also Elsie's. I now want to turn to my mother, Helena. And so Michael Young wrote in the preface to the biography that at times Helena took a more uncompromising view of Malinowski's shortcomings than I was inclined to do. Yet overall in her writing, I think, my mother depicts her father in a positive light and in places expresses affection for him. And sometimes this light shines very brightly. For example, my mother emphasizes that Malinowski, quote, expected women to be intellectually equal to men. And citing Audrey Richards, my mother writes that his women students, quote, blossomed in this atmosphere of being taken completely seriously. And this attitude, my mother writes, extended to his daughters, to whom he gave the gift of never feeling that women are inferior to men. And this was by no means a common gift in my youth. So there's a clear contrast between how my mother talks about her father and what we have learned indirectly from Józefa's children about how she talked about, in case what she thought about her father, an arrogant shit, and other words of that kind. Where my mother's stories are less flattering about Malinowski, even damning, she does, I think, pull her punches. So, for example, she tells the story of her and her sister's arrival in the United States in 1939. War had just broken out in Europe. Malinowski was already at Yale. He brought his daughters over to the States to get away from a Europe facing war. So they arrived in New York, and with respect to that, or with the reference to that, my mother writes, neither Malinowski's partner, girlfriend, soon to be second wife, Valletta Swan, neither Valletta Swan nor more curiously my father considered making a home for his daughters in New Haven. We lived with, and I'm glad to say we were befriended by others, mostly in New York. I showed that to a friend of mine, and he wrote back and said that phrase more curiously, I mean, that what a sort of painfully controlled, he wrote. And certainly the tone of this passage contrasts with my mother's tone and mood state when she told me the same story face to face. How aged 14, she arrived in America where she knew no one apart from her father and her sisters and possibly one family friend, but effectively no one, or very few people. How living in a boarding house, she asked her father if she couldn't come to live with him in New Haven, and how in reply he said no. He was too busy, or words to that effect. I can't remember the exact words. Now that refusal seems to me to be heartless, even cruel, and unpardonably so. But one has to read that into what my mother writes. And I think in private conversation with her grown-up children, and this might also have been true of her discussions with Michael Young, my mother felt able to be frank or in her views about her father, but not in public. She would, I think, have regarded public discussion of the intimate aspects of family affairs as unseemly. And I wouldn't have been surprised if she would have found the documentary Savage Memory, those passages in my cousin's memoir, What Wasn't I Thinking, Sebastian's memoir, which are about Malinowski and Elsie, but also quite possibly this paper is slightly, well, not quite the right thing to do. You know, one doesn't wash dirty linen in public. My mother did, however, I think, change her mind somewhat about Malinowski as she found out more about him through reading the letters, and she changed her views about his treatment of Elsie when Elsie was ill and dying. She didn't, I think, use the word abandon or neglect, but I think she came to think more in those terms than she had before. Her generally positive portrayal of her father informed also my mother's presentation of Malinowski and Elsie to my sister and me when we were growing up. And we were brought up with stories about our maternal grandparents, and the stories that my mother told us painted a picture of a happy childhood. I remember various anecdotes about Malinowski, some of which have appeared in print in the biography and in Story of a Marriage, one of which is my favorite for its pointless pedantry. Apparently Malinowski used to ask when he wanted to hear what was in the newspapers or on the radio, he did not what's the news, but what are the news? He thought that was very funny. So we grew up with the idea that our grandparents had been just parents, you know, like our own, and we had no reason to assume that they didn't love each other and support each other, care for each other. So perhaps my mother was making a conscious effort to paint this positive portrait of her parents and her childhood for her children, which would have been the right thing to do. One wants to make one's children happy. My sister has suggested that our mother, quote, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to fast, sanctified her parents in her own memory. And if she did, for good reason, I think, that the childhood was difficult. My sister again, sanctified her parents in her own memory. And if this is so, it makes sense that she would have passed on this sanctified view to her children. And then my sister again, having lost her parents young and not having known her own grandparents, Mummy wanted to create for her children, for me and Lucy, my sister, a little bit of a perfect world with grandparents in it. This is plausible. Whatever the explanation, however, for how my mother talked to me and Lucy about her parents and childhood, my sister and I have grown up unburdened by having had Malinowski as a grandfather, without feeling that we'd been scarred by Elsie's early death. So a couple of final words. I think the explanation of this difference, or at least the one that I'm happy with, lies in, the explanation of the difference between how, on the one hand, my cousins, Josefa's children, have responded to feel about Malinowski and Elsie on the one hand, and how my sister and I feel, has to do with how Malinowski was passed on to us by our respective mothers. All of us, I think, the grandchildren, agree in our assessment of Malinowski's character broadly, and we're aware of the pain that Elsie's death caused to her children. But when we were growing up, we were told different stories, and given a different idea about who Malinowski was and what the marriage was like and what the girl's childhood was like. And I think that it explains why we, my sister and I, feel, as I've said, unburdened. We don't feel that we are cursed in any way by Malinowski. May I say one more thing?
Yeah.
I just, the one thing I felt writing this is regret that I didn't talk more to my mother about her parents, and indeed to my aunts. But I would have had to talk to my aunts much earlier, and I would have had to have been quite a bully to get them to talk, and I might well have failed. And I wonder why I didn't sit down with my mother, and there are various reasons. But I think perhaps maybe I'd inherited, or I was aware of her need to be discreet or to control, in a sense, her memories about her childhood, and perhaps I respected that, and that's why I didn't badger her to say more. But I wish I had. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Patrick, for this.
That's me.
Yeah, and now Anna Engelking from the Institute of Slavic Studies, Polish Academy of Sciences, will continue with Malinowski as a person, but in another context, in the context of tutoring his students, and especially Józef Obrębski. The title of her speech is Under the Wing of the Rockefeller Foundation. That is about Obrębski and Malinowski once again.
Thank you very much. And I'm going on. 10 years after the publication of Argonauts of the Western Pacific, a close student of Malinowski, Józef Obrębski, began his ethnographic research in the community of Orthodox Highlanders in the Macedonian region of Porece in order to collect material for his doctoral thesis. It was the first fieldwork of a European village based thoroughly on Malinowski's ethnographic field method and functional theory, and Obrębski was his only student at the time to conduct fieldwork in a non-colonial country outside of the borders of the British Empire. Obrębski, aged 25, came to London in the middle of November 1930 as a fellow of the Rockefeller Foundation, which had in the previous year opened the Social Sciences Fellowship Program in Eastern Europe. He held a master's degree from Jagiellonian University, where he studied under two prominent scholars, the Slavist and linguist Kazimierz Nicz, who was a friend of Malinowski, and the ethnographer of Slavs Kazimierz Moszyński. He obtained the fellowship on the initiative and thanks to Malinowski, to whom the both professors from Kraków recommended their gifted student. The fellowship was first granted for a year and subsequently prolonged for another year and again for 2 months until the end of December 1932. Due to Rockefeller's funding, Obrębski could carry out an 8-month-long fieldwork in Macedonia, which at the time was a province of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia under the name of South Serbia. The student and the teacher quickly established both a scientific and personal connection, one that would also encompass their families. During Obrębski's fieldwork, they exchanged letters, although Obrębski did not fulfill his teacher's wish to report him every fortnight. After finishing his fieldwork, he returned to London in the beginning of April 1933. In January 1934, he obtained the title of Doctor of Philosophy in Social Anthropology from the University of London, awarded on the basis of the thesis Family Organization Among Slavs, as reflected in the custom of Kuvad, written under the supervision of Malinowski. Taking up the subject of Obrębski and Malinowski once again, for I have written about them already in several places, I will focus on the London Macedonian period of Obrębski's scientific life, sketched out above. The correspondence kept in English and Polish archives between Obrębski and Malinowski and between the former and the Rockefeller Foundation officers, as well as other people, gives a good insight into the context and course of Obrębski's research in the Macedonian Porečie. Analysis of said correspondence tells us of both the personal relationship of the teacher and his student and the circumstances of Obrębski's contribution to anthropology that was his work in Macedonia. Only now are we understanding the full extent of this contribution, as the complete Polish edition of Obrębski's Macedonian writings is being published right now in 2022, 2 years after the publication of an English edition of his selected writings. Obrębski and Malinowski met in person in July 1930 during Malinowski's visit to Krakow. At that time, Obrębski was already a candidate for the Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship. In the LSE archives, there are 3 his letters to Malinowski from before that time regarding the scientific, organizational, and financial aspects of Obrębski's planned studies in London. Of their meeting in Krakow, Malinowski wrote in the following way to John Van Sickle, director of the Rockefeller Foundation's office in Paris, responsible for fellowships in social sciences. I quote, "I tested Obrębski for his knowledge of English. I am certain he would follow my lectures from the very first moment. Taking his scientific qualifications, his specialization in Slavonic kinship and family, and his linguistic capacity, I should like to throw in all my weight in support of his application," unquote. 2 weeks after Obrębski's arrival in London, in another letter to Van Sickle, Malinowski designed the shape of his tutelage over his student. Quote, "The Christmas and Easter holidays, I submit, he should spend in London, where I shall be able to give him some private tuition. For the summer holidays, I should like him to come somewhere to Oberbosen, where both climate and the proximity of the supervisor might be an advantage to him. I like him personally," unquote. As is well known, Malinowski would often establish personal relationships with his students and invite them to his family's summer house in Oberbosen during the holidays. Raymond Firth described his didactic style as a, quote, "liberal interpretation of the role of a teacher," and went on to say that it was his capacity for friendship and sympathy, going beyond the relations of a teacher to pupil, that helped to strengthen his attraction, unquote. The close touch between teacher and student was known and appreciated also by Józef's family in Poland. His sister, Antonina Obrębska, a linguist and an assistant of Kazimierz Nicz, wrote to him, quote, "With the Malinowskis, he is, it seems, on very good terms. He recently stayed in their flat when they were away. He visits Mrs. Malinowska in the countryside," unquote. In May 1931, thanks to Malinowski's effort, the Rockefeller Foundation agreed to Obrębski spending the following academic year abroad, accompanying Malinowski during his sabbatical leave on the French Riviera in the vicinity of Toulon. Quote, "I'm going to devote my sabbatical year to the working out of my field material," Malinowski wrote to Van Sickle. And Obrębski, in remaining constantly in touch with me, could learn a great deal about the handling of fieldwork in this method. He is preparing now 2 articles, one on the function of the Kuvad among the Slavonic peoples and one on kinship terminologies of the Bulgarians. Both papers, of which I have seen the draft, will be, in my opinion, distinct contributions to science, and I trust to see them published soon in one of our special journals. In all his work, he is adapting the methods of functional anthropology to the very extensive but somewhat inchoate material on Slavonic sociology and folklore. In doing this, he will, I hope, fertilize the social anthropology of the Slavonic countries. He will make available for Western science the result of Slavonic sources, unquote. Meanwhile, he spent 3 months from July to October 1931 with the Malinowski's in Oberbosen. Some information about this stay comes from Józef's sister's letters to Nietzsche. In September 31, Antonina came to Oberbosen to visit her brother, who, quote, really wanted to see me in order to discuss some semantological issues in a new Anglo-American science, unquote. Earlier, due to the fact that Józef, who never was a diligent correspondent, did not reply to her letters, she herself corresponded with Malinowski. Quote, Malinowski now writes to our entire family, she told Nietzsche. He wrote to mother on his own accord to calm her down. He gave Józio an earful, as a result of which the prodigal son now writes grand letters and makes excuses, unquote. From Oberbosen, she wrote to Nietzsche, quote, I am slowly getting to know the Malinowski's. Józio is learning and working like a dog. He is quite pleased and has gotten audacious. I am very happy for him. The Malinowski's are wonderful people, unquote. In Coral Gardens, Malinowski laid out his synthesis of ethnology and linguistics, and Obrębski took part in the process of this book's creation. He helped his supervisor in analyzing the Kyrenian linguistic material, in which his good background in linguistics acquired at the Jagiellonian University undoubtedly helped. In October 1931, the Malinowski's relocated to Tamaris, where the work on Coral Gardens continued. Obrębski is mentioned a couple of times in the letters of Elsie, Malinowski's wife. From them, we learn, for example, that he taught her Polish. She wrote, quote, Obrębski is being a wonder, thinking of everything and doing a great deal. Lessons seem to be going well. Or, Obrębski and Miss Drew are working hard at vocabulary, unquote. In another letter to Van Sickle, Malinowski wrote of his student, quote, our friend Obrębski is doing exceedingly well here, doing his own fieldwork and also assisting in doing his own work and also assisting in mine. I hope he learns by this latter process. He has developed so quickly and is helping me so much that at times I wonder how I would be getting on without him. You know my definition of a good teacher, the man who can learn from his pupils. And I'm developing this quality in my old age to a considerable degree. In all probability, the spring of 1932 was the period when Obrębski's idea of fieldwork in Yugoslavia took shape. In April, in a memorandum on Obrębski written in Tamaris, Malinowski told Van Sickle, quote, it occurs to me that if you would allow him to spend the next 4 or 5 months in the Balkans, he might be able to apply in the field the new methods which he has acquired in working with me. Personally, I should be very much interested in what he might bring back now, after he has specialized in methods of sociological fieldwork. He has been working a great deal with me on my own material and on the theory of social anthropology, and I am confident he would do quite well alone in the field, unquote. In late May, Obrębski left for Belgrade. Elsie wrote to Bronisław, I quote, Obrębski came today to say goodbye, and you know how dead relationships depress me, unquote. In a footnote to these words, Helena Wayne, the editor of their correspondence, remarks, quote, there seems to have been a falling out between Obrębski and the Malinowski's, unquote. I do not know how to comment on this, other than to note that the student-teacher relationship would still continue and develop. Obrębski's fieldwork in the Macedonian Poreča eventually took about 8 months, from August 32 to March 33, instead of the planned 4 or 5. He asked Malinowski twice to prolong his stay in the field. At the beginning of November, in a letter sent from the village of Volce, which served as his headquarters in Poreča, Obrębski wrote, quote, "This would allow me to witness and describe 2 important ceremonies, Božić and Vodici. The first one is important due to the pan-procreative character of the Zadruga, the second in connection to the religious organization of the village and the character of religious beliefs. I would be greatly indebted should you authorize this plan, Professor." Unquote. The prolonged stay was to be financed by savings from the fellowship stipend. So it was. And 30 years later, Obrębski described the religious organization of the village in a paper called Social Structure and Ritual in a Macedonian Village, presented at the annual meeting of American Anthropological Association in Philadelphia in 1961. Poreča comprised a handful of villages situated in remote mountains and inhabited by a community of shepherds. Obrębski, a diligent student of Argonauts, was interested in primitive groups which had not yet been subjected to the disintegrating influence of modernity. He looked for a field that would be ethnically homogeneous and as isolated as possible, in a word, his own Trobriand Islands. Documenting the social structure and family life of the Porečans, their economic system, annual and family rites, healing art and magic, mythology and religion, Obrębski gathered abundant and unique materials. Freddie Fox wrote, I quote, "Anthropological knowledge was produced between the field and the LSE seminar, linked by pedagogy, internalized discipline, gifts, and displays of obedience and sometimes rebellion, and in writing back to Malinowski in London," unquote. Obrębski had a substantial role in creating this knowledge. When it comes to discipline and obedience, however, he was insubordinate. His field notes are sloppy. He did not always note down the dates and names of his interlocutors. He did not add colorful annotations, as Malinowski instructed his students. He did not use charts and schemes. In his field notes, there are maybe 3 small tables altogether. Although he made quite a lot of genealogical charts, drawings, and maps, and he would also take pictures. He did not send Malinowski reports of his fieldwork, despite the former's repeated requests. I quote, "As you remember, you agreed that you would write me twice a month, whereas in fact you have not written to me for over 4 months. So in the future, I hope you will keep to our agreement, unless you have very relevant reasons for not doing so," unquote. Obrębski also did not send his supervisor any text which would be ready for publication, even though Malinowski offered to translate it into English himself. Quote, "I would like to get at least one sample fairly fully written out, if you prefer in Polish or German, and I then would translate it into English and see if it could be published," unquote. 2 letters written to Malinowski by Obrębski in Yugoslavia survive, from June and November 32. It is unknown whether he wrote to him after that date. The second of the 2 letters could be seen as something of a modest report, although a letter to Moszyński written on April 4, 1933 in Calais, on his way back to London, is longer and more detailed. All 3 are fascinating testimonies to the struggle of an ethnographer with his field, from preliminary assumptions through adjusting them to reality, taking up a new research subject, to creating and testing new hypotheses. They also relate the difficult process of breaking through the interlocutor's distrust and steering the fieldwork from kinship to medicine, magic, and witchcraft. Of the period Obrębski spent in London after returning from Macedonia, we know very little. He continued his doctoral studies and lived on money saved from fellowship stipend. He certainly participated in Malinowski's seminar. Did he present the results of his Macedonian fieldwork? The extant sources do not mention this, but it is certainly probable. In the archives, there are several drafts in English, including an almost finished article called Bride Wealth in Macedonia. Could this have been his paper for the seminar? After obtaining his doctorate, Obrębski received a proposal of further cooperation in London from Malinowski. The details of this proposal, recalled by the Obrębski family, are unknown. Then, at the beginning of 1934, the 25-year-old doctor of social anthropology, who was the first to apply functionalism in theory and practice to the study of the European village, decided to return to Poland. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. So, so we have these two different images of Malinowski. And now we will still have another one. Aleksander Posern-Zieliński from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań will tell us about Latin American social anthropology and Malinowski's intellectual heritage.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure that I can participate in the conference dedicated to Malinowski, and I guess that now from Balkan Peninsula we can visit trekking Malinowski itinerary just to Latin America. Of course, all we know that Latin America was a really incident in Malinowski's scientific life. I'm referring to his field studies in Mexico and the state of Oaxaca. My colleague will be today describing this evaluation, this activity of Malinowski. So I skip this part of presentation. But going back to the situation of Latin America and Malinowski, why I decided, to present during this conference such a topic. I am from, let's say, partially from my interest, Latin Americanist, and for many years I constantly visited South American countries, from mostly Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile. So I have been acquainted not only with the, let's say, subject matter of culture and society of this continent, but also with the anthropology there located. So I guess that I have a glimpse of impression what is going on in development of the Latin American anthropology. As you know quite well, nowadays great discussion going on between let's say, regional or provincial anthropological area and the mainstream. There is even some kind of endeavor to create a so-called world anthropology to liquidate the gaps between regional anthropology. Latin American anthropology is just a good example, especially when we're referring to the second half of the last century. It was let's say, very good developed anthropology, but isolated from the mainstream, encapsulated in Spanish language, absolutely, with very small relationship between, in spite of the Spanish language, with Spain, because of the colonial past and, some distance, with very isolation also, or not isolation, a distance with UK, also because, let's say, some typical for Latin America, let's say, no distance, historical background of the distance it goes back to the colonial time, to the epoch when was a competition between Spain and Britain. So the Britain is not, as well, British anthropology is not so accepted in Latin America. This is a context of Malinowski, let's say, response, legacy, and reception in this continent. So the isolation is now overcome, especially in the last 2 decades. It is a question of mobility of South American and Middle American anthropologists. It's a pity, really, because the mobility is not just like our mobility to go to the conference and go back, but rather it's a one-way mobility to American universities. So it is brain drain of Latin American anthropology. But because of this brain drain, the ideas developed originally in the south part of the America's continent are now present in the mainstream, thanks to the not thanks to the translation, but thanks to the output of these newcomers to the university. In some cases, they first publish in English, and then they translate to their own mother tongue and publish in Peru, Bolivia, and Mexico. So it's a reverse process. Anyway, the language is the biggest factor. It was no problem for Malinowski in 1941 when he decided to go to Oaxaca, together along with field assistant and colleague, partner Juan de la Fuente, the young at that time anthropologist from Mexico, who helped him because Malinowski during his stay in Tenerife picked up, according to some sources, knowledge of communicating knowledge of Spanish language, so he was able, to do some field works. But the field assistant was the must, and not only for Malinowski, for me also in this such a distance culturally context. If we think about reception of the Malinowski's ideas in Latin America, we have to point out that the majority of the information about Malinowski came to the Latin America academia, not from, let's say, Malinowski's activity in Mexico, but from United States, from the informations published in United States. So when we discovered that after the death of Malinowski, especially in the 50s, and 60s, and 70s, when in the mainstream anthropology was a big critic against Malinowski's position, we were discussing this yesterday, these ideas, only ideas in handbooks and in some small information spread down from the north to Latin American academia, shaping the not unfavorable image of Malinowski. It was one factor. The second, let's say, Malinowski was seen from from Latin American anthropologists as a person who was involved in studies of some exotic, from their point of view, cultures, New Guinea, Africa. What does it mean for studies of Latin America? Nothing. So they were the typical feature of Latin American studies is that the Peruvian guy or Mexican person, a Mexican lady, studies only on surrounding, the own society, own in this sense that belongs to the space of the country. There could be some, let's say, society just exotic in the sense that belongs not to the mainstream Hispanic culture and society, but it could be it is some native community, but it is in the same time the own society, not a distant society. I don't have to go thousands of miles to be a part of some team. So it's a perspective of Latin American people, and the second factor is that associated with the language, the scarcity of libraries in this continent. It is very hard to get in this libraries English publications, or New York publications, or any American or English publications, even the French publications. If some book or article is not translated, it doesn't exist, absolutely. Another factor is that the students, in time they are not students, but members of academia making careers, they also are not so fluent in English, and the abundance of intercommunication between different countries in Latin America is so great that they don't have the feeling of isolation. Because they communicate, they go for different conferences from one country to another. The exchange of ideas is really very vivid. But only in this capsule of Spanish publication on Spanish language. So if there are a lot of publications, translations of Malinowski's work edited in Spain, but this, let's say, output was without any visible impact on Latin American specialists. The situation now is different. In the last 2 decades, I participated, for instance, just 10 years ago, exactly in 2012, in the conference associated with the release of the first Peruvian edition of Argonauts. It was my privilege to participate in this conference and to speak about, let's say, Polish roots of Malinowski, because this part of the story is absolutely unknown. In majority of cases, it is a good example of the distance between mainstream anthropology and mainstream vision of the history of anthropology and the perspective of Latin America. In many handbooks, which I went through, I found very not good information about the biography of Malinowski. Some examples. In majority of cases, Malinowski is written in the wrong way, with epsilon at the end, for instance, even in the title of translated books. His national affiliation is perceived very ambiguous. He is identified, let's say, as Jews, as Austrian, as British, as American, but never as a Polish. So it's a good example that even the authors of the handbooks of the history of anthropology didn't pay in the last century especially attention to study just original works, but only they duplicated some stereotypes. What is interesting also, what time I have? Okay, interesting. Okay, what is interesting that there is no doubt about this, that if Malinowski would live not a little longer in North America, his project to study in Mexico, maybe in other countries of Latin America, would be developed. He wrote in some places that in some of his texts that basing on his experience in Oaxaca, on his knowledge of Latin American anthropologists, he see that it's really very interesting new field of study, not only because it's possible, you know, to adapt his own developed in New Guinea and in Melanesia perspective, methodology, fieldwork strategy, but also because, as wrote Malinowski, it's very prospective for the development of theory of culture. And this aspect was very strongly expressed in the introduction of Malinowski to the very well-known book of Fernando Ortiz, a Cuban anthropologist, very well known and recognized all over the Latin American sphere. It was Ortiz wrote a book just I guess first in 1940 in Spanish and published in Cuba. And 2 years later or 3 years later was released English translations. In both of these editions we can find Malinowski's introduction. And Malinowski met in somewhere Ortiz, and they let's say treated themselves very seriously as intellectual partners. And Malinowski was struck by some ideas developed by Ortiz, theoretical approaches to interpretation of Latin American reality. Just briefly, Ortiz was against the concept of North American acculturation, one-way process of transmission of ideas from one culture to another, and he urged that studies of Latin America should be conducted from the perspective of the formation of the new entity, syncretic entity, just absolutely new. And he postulated to abolish, to put on the margin the American term of acculturation and propose a term of a new term, a neologism, transculturation. Both these ideas were just very, very accepted by Malinowski. And it was the reason that he wrote this introduction, encouraging all these Latin American colleagues in the future to follow the steps of Ortiz. But the funny story is that this small introduction, a couple of pages, are now very important in the following years. Let's say even today are much more cited, quoted, are much more intensively discussed and criticized than Malinowski's really very solid book on Oaxaca village community. What is the reason? I don't know. Probably the fame of Ortiz, the circulation of his book. And so the critics of Malinowski are doing some kind of, let's say, theological exegesis of word by word expressed by Malinowski, trying, you know, to extract some wrong descriptions. And the good example is that, Malinowski probably wanted to be very polite to the Ortiz. He said that the approach of the Ortiz is quite similar to his own. It means to functionalism. So it was, you know, functionalism is the worst expression in Latin America. So it's because it's association with colonialism, racism, and all burdens of the past. So this one extracted word is now discussed by many critics of Malinowski, because he mentioned that they accused Malinowski that he deprived Ortiz of own original contribution, and that it is a good example of paternalism of mainstream anthropology of the white man to Ortiz. Anyway, this is an example. Such examples are many could be quoted. And going to the conclusion, the situation in 21st century is slowly changed, as I mentioned before. Now we observe since, let's say, 1996, 2006, 2007, in different countries, in Bogota and Sao Paulo, especially in Brazil, there's a growing interest in output of Malinowski. It's associated with, let's say, with the translations, with the elimination of this discourse, anti-colonialistic discourse, and with the drive of Latin American anthropologists to be more, let's say, open for, say, for the mainstream ideas. I forgot to mention also, but it is another story, that in the 50s and the 60s, Latin American anthropology was just very strongly polarized between, let's say, followers of the American cultural anthropology and, I don't know, anthropology infected by Marxism in different mutations, from, let's say, French Marxism to Maoism and Trotskyism. And in universities, it was very strong trend. Anyway, it was also the one of the factors that hamper spread of Malinowski's idea in this continent. Just recently, in last 5 years, because of the Argonauts, I noticed a few, at least 7, 6 conferences, like our conferences, organized in different countries of Latin America on the occasion to commemorate Argonauts, and they discuss mostly not the colonial past, not the functionalism, but they appreciate very much the field strategy of the Malinowski, incorporated in the first chapter of the book. So, and another expression of the interest of the rebirth of the interest of Malinowski is hundreds of articles published in Spanish with the idea to compare Malinowski's output with some already recognized figure of the mainstream anthropology. So there are studies on Malinowski and Lévi-Strauss, on Malinowski and Moss and Zimmel, on Malinowski and Geertz and Durkheim, and so on and so on. So it's an expression that Malinowski should take a place in the same areopag of this first class of the anthropological heroes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, and finally, Deborah James from London School of Economics will tell about Malinowski and the Argonaut, 100 years of economic anthropology and the ethnographic method. And it is yours.
That's a good one.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's been a great privilege to be here. This paper is more like a report back on another conference about the Argonauts, which we had in June, or July actually, at the LSE. So hopefully it won't be too list-like, but I'm basically giving a few themes that arose in this workshop that we held. Now, it was suggested originally by Chris Hahn, who was at the time the outgoing director of the Max Planck Institute in Halle, and he and I, as one of the economic anthropologists on the staff at LSE, collaborated together. He provided lots of the money from different things that he's got, including the MPI, so thanks are due to them. We also provide some of the money, and this little logo was designed by some people from, I think it was EASA, but I forgot the exact name, but thanks to them as well for this nice little logo about the Argonauts. So just to sort of point out that some of the ones that were presented at the workshop, I won't be summarizing here because some of them are actually here. So Michael Young's paper was delivered, Adam did his paper, Grażyna did a paper roughly similar to the one that she's done, and Alexander was there as commentator as well. But I'm going to then go ahead and talk about some of the other papers that were done. And the themes came under sort of these four broad ideas there, which I'm just going to sort of go through the actual papers roughly to say what they were about and pick out certain common themes that they had. So the first one is about labor, recruitment, colonialism, and power. And this refers back to a few things we've heard about in a couple of days, including in Alexander's paper right now, concerning the question about how Malinowski was related to the imperial project. So first of all, Rachel Smith gave a paper which explored Malinowski's ideas about incentives to work, especially to do arduous labor on plantations at the time. And she points out that in Malinowski's approach to this question, there's a broad distinction between the drudgery of labor for white plantation owners, and there was a lot of this going on at the time, and the fulfilling character of that in the local setting, that which makes life worth living, i.e. what people do in their own gardens and so on. And in this local work is where Malinowski found the incentive, including that which underlay cooperation with others in shared productive activities, precisely in magic, religion, and kinship structures and organization. That was where the incentive to work lay. But he was disturbed by the notion that there should be other kinds of incentives to work being put upon people through this plantation system being run by whites. He actually participated in a commissioned report, an international commissioned report, and he was largely in agreement with that report to some degree, where he connected depopulation and problems associated with contact with Western civilization, including the introduction of alcohol and disease via plantation labor, but also depression and despondency. These things he condemned, as did the report overall. However, where he was at odds with that report, and it was not in fact reproduced in the main body of it, was his more radical contention that it might be better if recruitment was simply to cease and the islanders left alone, uncontaminated, a kind of a slightly romantic viewpoint. Now, this was taken up as well by Freddie Fox in his paper, and he spoke about, again, the system of plantation labor and its role in consolidating or undermining traditional arrangements, but also its relationship to colonialism. He characterizes Malinowski's attitudes towards this kind of work, plantation labor type system as ambivalent. And he sees Argonauts as implicitly a kind of critique of indentured migrant labor, plantation agriculture. The Kula was the mirror image or the opposite of that system of production, that plantation labor system. And the book was meant, he said, as a kind of critique of utilitarian or profit-driven economics. To draw labor away from the system via recruitment would necessarily degrade the economy. And so Malinowski, shows Fox, supported a protectionist approach, which he called trusteeship. Now, Fox is saying we should not simply interpret Malinowski's functionalism in retrospect as an ideology of imperialism, something we've heard quite a lot about in the last few days. Instead of seeing him either as a cultural relativist or an imperialist, it's more appropriate to see him as both. He did support rule by chiefs, including the limitation of the right to declare war, and also the retaining by the colonial administration of the monopoly of a legitimate force, but he did so in the interest of the natives, and this would be sidelined by settler economic profit-driven interests. He also spoke out at the time against the decimation of the Herero in German Southwest Africa. So these are the two papers that kind of dealt in some way or other with the whole imperial question. Very closely linked to these was a very kind of well-known question when we talk about Malinowski of exactly what is economic and what is non-economic, and how do the two interrelate. The papers that we heard here showed how Malinowski was somehow sidelined, and with him a whole group of thinkers, now thought of as slightly on the side stream or not part of the mainstream. Several papers pointed out here that just because production, exchange, and consumption were regulated by custom and kinship and so on, this did not mean that islanders weren't economically minded. But the idea is, had Malinowski's ideas been taken more seriously in the first place, we might have ended up with a different idea of what economic actually is. So first of all, Chris Gregory wrote this paper taking us into questions of knowability and uncertainty, both as described by economics and as described by, well, anthropology, which at the time were not so separate as they have subsequently become. So he shows how Malinowski played a key role in these debates. His work was actually mainstream in economics at the time. Gregory's paper drew comparisons and contrasts between Keynes and Malinowski, and as I say, his writings at the time were considered quite core to the discipline of economics. Keynes, like others in the Bloomsbury group, was opposed to the Benthamite approach with its cold calculation. His, quote from Gregory, his theory of the knowability of the unknowable reveals a paradox that lies at the heart of mainstream theory of entrepreneurial decision-making, namely that the necessity for action in the face of incalculable economic uncertainty leads to the paradox of having to measure the unmeasurable. And it is this fact which, according to Gregory, subsequent economists have literally ignored. They have pretended that you can know the unknowable by using various kinds of numbers and magic, almost magic spells. And so there's an interesting paradox in this thing. So Malinowski's complement to this very same idea derived from his observation of the ritual pronouncements, and this is what Gregory in his paper terms theology, in Argonauts and also in Coral Gardens. Here, similar levels of uncertainty are expressed, but in verbal rather than numerical terms, through spells and incantation. For both, says Gregory, there was a recognition that we simply do not know. And this is something that mainstream economics was unable at the time and is still unable to accept. Now, Richard Staley, who's a philosopher of science, took a similar kind of point of view, but slightly different line of argument. So where Gregory had showed that the primary methods of anthropology and neoclassical economics diverged in this period, with the latter, neoclassical economics, taking an individualistic, psychological, deductive approach, Staley claims instead that these two disciplinary areas actually shared quite a common culture of discourse and many terms of reference, drawing from what Knight called prevalent mores of social discussion at the time. In two ways he showed this. One of them was relating to the notion of primitive economic man. Malinowski claimed that Trobrianders were not in a pre-economic stage, but rather manifested distinct forms of economic organization. So he argued for a new or different kind of economics. Coining the term tribal economy, his 1921 paper in the Economical Journal was addressed to economists and called on them in the spirit of wide comparison, even universalism, to do research into native conceptions. We have surely gone backwards. No modern economist in the strict sense would ever give a second thought to studying Pacific Islanders. A second convergence that Staley talks about was in the idea of mechanism. This is an idea derived from the rapid advance in physics and machinery around the time. By 1945, this idea was being applied by Hayek to the market, who saw prices as this kind of impersonal mechanism. Now, Malinowski also used a similar term, but he used the term system to describe the cooler, but mechanism to describe the division of labor. But basically, they were drawing on a kind of common universe of concepts and discourses. Now, arguing in almost the opposite direction was a paper by Mark Moscow. He draws on his own fieldwork in Kiruwana, and his paper suggests that Malinowski obscured important aspects of what the magic that he describes was all about. Instead of that magic operating in a rather mechanical, possibly even a mechanism-style operation. People pronounce things and everything goes right in your cooler arrangements. He actually says that this very theology of the kind that Gregory is talking about, the dense verbiage used by magicians in uttering their incantations, did not simply work in a quasi-mechanical manner, but rather by virtue of communications, especially sacrificial reciprocities with ancestral spirits, Baloma. And in fact, the ancestral spirits themselves even had their own kula, which mirrored but partly duplicates and penetrates and influences that of their living descendants. And this is what Malinowski, according to Mark Moscow, is kind of ignoring. He's seeing it simply as something within the realm of, the material reality of life. So bringing this forward to contemporary times, and also making a few similar points to those made yesterday by Dominic and today by Alexander, Ariel Wilkes, who's an economic sociologist from Argentina, showed how and why the legacy of the Argonauts failed to translate into one disciplinary vision of the relation between economy and society, but did take root in another. So he points out that Malinowski's work, generally speaking, was not much taken any notice of in United States economic sociology, but via France and into Argentina, it really did take root, and especially when the works of Zelizer were translated into French, so suddenly the Argonauts became known, and he himself used it in his own recent book. Okay, and then finally, sorry, this one's actually in a different, so I've put one of them in the wrong place. Okay, so moving on briefly to this other subsection, Modernizing Malinowski, Alternative Economic Frameworks. A paper by Jeffrey and Stephanie Hobbes talked about the fact that the Argonauts of the Western Pacific are surfing the World Wide Web. What they show is that, interestingly, although a lot of the sort of trade has gone digital, actually, like much else that is Melanesian, the form of economics going on here is both in but also beyond capitalism. The interlocutors they spoke to surf the World Wide Web to build, maintain, and strengthen relationships of perpetual mutual indebtedness. But in doing so, they partly do it in order to acquire relational fortune and fame, not only simply wealth. Intriguingly, they describe something called the Bush Internet, where there's reliance not only on the digital sphere, the web, but also on people who have to download files out of formal internet cafes and onto micro SD cards and flash drives, and then take them in their pockets through mangrove swamps in dugout canoes and bring them to other islands. This is what they call the Bush Internet, a human object, non-grid communications network that brings the country into a new sort of ring. So there you've got what's happening to the cooler, and then it turns into people using Facebook and buy and sell groups, which what they call bush markets. Now, Benoît de Nestroil from France talked about a rather different kind of perspective to the question of Malinowski and frameworks on the economy. And he says that despite the best efforts of Malinowski to open up new horizons for anthropology and alongside Keynes to make scholars see primitive economic life as existing alongside its more Western equivalent, actually what has tended to happen, partly because of Malinowski's legacy, he says, is that anthropology has tended to thrive as the study of other economies. And he talked quite a lot about this in his paper. He says that this kind of divide in the end has been something which he and many others have tried to sort of circumvent. And the way he does this is by referring to his own fieldwork in present-day Brazil, northern Brazil, and favela neighborhoods in Rio. And he shows how there he interprets, instead of using notions of economy such as Malinowski spoke about them, the ancient Greek word economia, a term, he says, which is too often mistranslated in too strictly economic a sense, which leaves out its original sense of government and autonomy. And he says that, although it sounds kind of paradoxical, because the people he's talking about are actually living in extreme uncertainty and continually being subjected to haphazard and indiscriminately random government forces, which make control within the house quite unlikely, in a strange paradoxical way, for these people, these women and men in this kind of really poor neighborhoods, it is that control which is absolutely central to economia as he sees it. So simply focusing on things like money, salary, minimum wage, costs, and prices would give only half the picture. You need to focus on this question of autonomous government as well. This is where I forgot to. So this paper by Maxim Bolt also drew on his own fieldwork in urban post-apartheid South Africa, and it somewhat echoes Staley's interest in these sort of metaphors that are used by economists and anthropologists. So whereas he was talking about mechanism, Bolt is talking about the idea of circulation. And he says that this term, very much used by Malinowski in the Kula work, tends to sort of assume a one-way process of things going in one direction and then other things going in the other, always in a sense quite a linear process. Without going into too much detail, he draws on his work on how sort of family-owned houses in apartheid South Africa have now been turned into privately owned houses, and that there's the process of circulation is often interrupted. So he talks about a context of fracture, bitter dispute among claimants, a broader lack of moral consensus, substantial confusion about a complicated and burdensome system, and obstacles to navigating its institutional avenues. All of these could be things which, seen in a less idealistic and systematized way, Kula circulation could equally have been interrupted, and the flow would not necessarily have been as kind of automatic as originally presumed. So finally, moving on then to this last two papers, Deeper Time, Deep Structures and Other Kulas. Hans Steinmüller wrote, mainly drawing on other people's work, about the Kula, about the fact that Malinowski perhaps failed to recognize the sort of longer term history, including the violence, because there was a lot of war being basically fought out between the islanders, that subsequently that was brought to an end by colonial pacification. He talks about how this pacification must have massively inflated the value of Kula items, and then ultimately draws on some archaeological work to sort of make an interesting proposal about the longer term kinds of processes of which the Kula was simply one moment in time. And then finally, a very bold interpretation by Yongye Liang called Interpreting Kula with Laozi talks about a work of Chinese literature, the 6th century, which promoted the idea of the sage who refuses to accumulate. Here we find a similar attribution of preciousness to goods that nevertheless cannot be accumulated, but find their value only in circulation, and a similar emphasis on how organization, technology, and calendar systems serve to keep societies integrated, but also small and peaceful. Right, so this was in summary the kind of main themes that came out. And we were very pleased overall with the way that our call for papers enabled some fruitful discussions. Critical views of the book were there. They were productive, though, not simply dismissive. Participants put Malinowski's intellectual achievements and style of analysis into their context at the time and also into the places where they were born, including here in Krakow by Grażyna, but also traversing Australia, Tenerife, and London, where our workshop was held. Forms of explanation about how the economic differs from the non-economic, which have played out in the subsequent century, as well as metaphors like mechanism and circulation that remain current today, were interrogated and explored. Colonial assumptions were discussed, but the lasting importance of the book somehow transcended the limitations often implied by such discussions. Modern-day fieldwork was drawn upon to amplify and deepen our understanding of Malinowski's concerns. All in all, we felt we came up with some useful answers to our guiding question: how can the kind of fieldwork pioneered by Malinowski a century ago be adapted and stretched to serve the agendas of contemporary post-colonial anthropology? And in addition to all that, there's actually an exhibition being launched by the LSE Library. I think it's today, and I'm hoping to find out the link, so in case anybody would like to have a look at it. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, we finished with the papers, and now I would like to ask Ewa Kopczyńska, my colleague from our social anthropology section, to discuss the papers.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if I can discuss the papers because there's so much interesting ideas, and they were very different, and lots of inspiring and important aspect has been mentioned. But let me just share two general points, or emphasize two aspects of what has been said today and yesterday as well. So firstly, thank you very much for the presentation. That was a great deal of wonderful and very interesting information and thoughts and ideas. I would like to focus firstly on the last presentation by Deborah and the economic thought, this is interesting personally for me because I'm doing food and consumption studies, and it's very much resonates how you critically and critically refer to what has been said by Malinowski himself and his critics, and I'm thinking about how the economy and economics is questioned and is questioned. Sorry. So we are thinking about the economy and economics as a way of grasping the reality. And you said that we use this duality of economic and non-economic practices and aspects of our life. This is very much discussed in contemporary economy and sociology and cultural studies, anthropology, and so on. And we still, I believe, lack this integration of different perspectives, and we still are not ready to understand and to study how things, practices, ideas, material, objects, and so on, can be seen as economic and, for example, cultural items, things, objects. And contemporary situation is adding some extra layer to that when we think about all the crises we have nowadays, like environmental and political and economic, and we still cannot integrate those different perspectives. So I believe that those questions you raised are very relevant to contemporary perspective, and all the ideas of the alternative economies and different economies, and not economy as a whole, or not economy as a overwhelming general, the theory, but as a anthropological perspective of it. Like there's a diversity of economies and diversity of economic practices, but they are cultural and family and traditional at the same time. So this is one thing that I would like to emphasize. And another thing that kind of refer to all the presentation is I have this recurring impression that we are talking about Malinowski and Malinowski thought from the perspective of duality. So it's, I don't know, it's local versus cosmopolitan. It's personal versus professional. It's narcissistic in a way and very generous person at the same time. And there has been a lot of this contradiction, something versus something in the presentations yesterday and today, and again today presentations were very much like in the line, probably in my mind. So I wonder, does it say anything more about Malinowski himself? Like he was this kind of person that could travel between different layers and different dimensions or different classes maybe, and contexts and way of writings, or does it say more about the time, his time, that the duality of thinking in a dual frame during his time, or does it say more about how we try to grasp this complicated legacy of his? So yeah, I will stop here and just thoughts for the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very useful start. So I'm opening the floor. Any comments or questions to presenters? Yeah?
I have a small comments to the paper.
Microphone. Microphone.
Okay.
So I have a small comments to the paper of Professor Engelking regarding the Obrębski and relationship between Obrębski and Malinowski. During my work on Obrębski's archive, which is located in Amherst, Massachusetts, I found one document. It is, let's say, some kind of evaluation of Obrębski's achievement written by Malinowski, and Malinowski states that according to him, Obrębski belongs to his best pupils intellectually and anthropologically. Ready to occupy a position in the university, in academia, American academia. And during my stay in Amherst and some conversations with people from academia who know the story about Obrębski, the very, very sad story of his last years in United States, all of them, expressed absolutely such a strange feeling why Obrębski, who was really very brave guy and with good achievement, maybe not so well known in the United States, why he was not able to get a stable position after the Second World War, and circulated really in colleges, second league colleges in New York at the time when was quite active institution in the center of New York. I'm referring to a New School of Social Research dedicated especially to such people like Obrębski. Nobody knows really what was the reason. It is a question of psychology, of course, and of the trajectory of Obrębski's life. But he was really, I'm referring to Obrębski, he was really trapped in this sense that he was a follower. I'm referring now to his experience in Jamaica when he worked as a member of the team sent by London School of Economics. He was trapped because we have heard in your presentation that Obrębski, and we know reading Obrębski's paper on Polesie and on Balkan issues, that Obrębski was a typical anthropologist, attached to and follower to some degree of the method of filtering of Malinowski. And when he was sent to Jamaica, I went through the archival paper, the field notes Obrębski did at that time, thousands of sheets, and they are absolutely contrasting in all he preferred. There was just a quantitative ethno-economic sociology, but he did this day by day, preparing thousands of one-sheet records for any family and so on. And I was not able to discover any portion of, let's say, Malinowski's impact on this kind of work. And maybe, no, he was just a hired worker, intellectual worker with the obligation to do this, and he was pushed all the time. It is also reflected by the correspondence. He was pushed by his master lady, to do the more reports, and finally he was so in stress of such a situation, first time in the life, that he left Jamaica with all this stuff, and maybe this situation was the reason for his, let's say, not so good, how to say, strategy to get a position in New York. Yes, but it was a very strange for all these people who study Obrębski's archive and last years of Obrębski's in New York days. It is a strange thing that Malinowski was not so present in his work in Jamaica. I could imagine, for instance, that, okay, if I would be on Obrębski's position, for instance, I would develop another strategy, just, you know, the half-day work for the project according to the direction of London School of Economics, or the and the half-day with the same informants, I would be able, you know, to get some information of anthropological contents. But Obrębski didn't follow such a way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's take a few more comments or questions, and then I will give the floor to the presenters. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. I've got a question for Patrick. I thought that was really fascinating, and I wondered, in some ways, I felt like the story you told could probably be told of very many families. And I was wondering if there was something about the kind of fact that this man had been so famous that almost led some of his descendants, like you say, one branch, to kind of like almost seek for some blame to be placed retrospectively. And even when you said to yourself, you wish that there was a bit more time where you sat down with your mother, asked her more about her parents. I'm sure all of us feel that way. I feel that way right now about my own mother, who's still alive, but she won't be able to tell me that much. But I'm just wondering, why is it that one would assume that maybe the true account, if you just did sit down with your mother, might be the one that brings out more negative elements, whereas the sort of account that she's giving to the world is like, oh, he was actually a great man, etc., would be false. So there's something interestingly kind of, I guess, psychoanalytic about this. We have to delve down into maybe the negative elements of families to find out what must be true, because there must be something bad under the surface. Just a comment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would just like to follow. Could you switch off the mic? Sorry. I also had this impression, especially that Helena, whom I know quite well, she was the age of my mother, and my mother also lost her father exactly in 1942, but my grandfather died in the concentration camp. But I think that that my mother was somehow for the whole life some, you know, to some extent under the influence of this fact, you know, that she lost her beloved father. So my personal contact with Helena was I think also closer because of this, but I always had a feeling that she was that she was not judging, you know, that she was just interested. She wanted to know. She did a lot of work. Archivizing and interviewing people and so on. So she was just as I think not that much as family member, but a researcher, you know, who would like to know more. And I think that this attitude of hers was very fruitful in a sense, and perhaps this made her open and not to fix like emotionally on some problems, but open to, you know, to get a lot of knowledge she didn't know. Who else would like to comment or say something? Oh, sorry. But
I just want to make one or two comments. I found this really a fascinating session. On Patrick's paper, one thing I want to ask about is in his mother's fascinating paper in American Anthropologist on some women in Malinowski's life and so on. I think, I'm not sure I'm recording this correctly, maybe it was somewhere else, but I think it's there. She said that when her mother was dying, the daughters hoped that Audrey Richards would marry Malinowski and in order to look after the girls, because she was one of the few people to whom the daughters regarded as a kind of mother figure who stuck by them right through this period. And when I wrote this up, Raymond Firth said to me, at the time, both Audrey and Malinowski had other attachments, and so it was not a practical matter. But nevertheless, I find that very interesting, that they were looking for an alternative mother, and of course, they were very disappointed then by the relationship with the latter. That's something come in. And your paper, I thought, was again very fascinating, completely new to me. It was the whole story was very, very interesting. But what brings out for me, what makes me think about again, is the extent to which European village ethnographies in the 1930s and 1940s switched from the old-fashioned customs and material culture and so forth to a more sociological picture, often invoking the Trobrinders or Malinowski as a kind of model. And this you find in the studies of Ireland at the time, Wales, Quebec. And I mean, part of the problem is, of course, that they are romanticizing and so on, but nevertheless, this was a new model of doing fieldwork in village studies. Alexander's paper, I think, again, absolutely fascinating to me, but I just wonder whether there's another aspect of Malinowski's contribution which left him outside the mainstream of discussions in Central American anthropology then at the time, which is the discussion of the mestizo phenomenon, and which was both politically, ideologically, but also ethnographically central. So instead of studying the Indians or the whites, there was this new idea of the mixed population, which was going to become the true Mexican or the true Peruvian, and so on and so forth. And of course, that's not at all present, as I remember in Malinowski's account, although it became the main system of discourse in Central American anthropology. And finally, if I could just say something about Deborah's paper, which I thought was a tour de force, sort of brilliant summary of that very, very interesting conference. I just want to go on to this notion of the way in which Malinowski's alternative economics of what was happening in these societies becomes the economy of the house, particularly in Steve Gooderman's work, but in various other people's work, Bernard Latral, as you say, also picks it up. But I think it has another avatar, which is in Meyer Fortis's idea of the politico-jural domain and the domestic domain. And the domestic domain is the domain not only of the house, politically and economically, but also of the house as a different morality system to the politico-jural domain, which is seen as coming from outside and imposing arbitrary and often resisted demands on people. And that the morality of the house is the morality of the family, of kinship, of a whole different way of life. And that is also derived by Meyer Fortis, although he doesn't say it enough because he reacts so much against Malinowski, but it derives very much from the Malinowski model of this alternative economy, which is based on a different morality, which is a kinship morality.
Thank you. Any more comments? If not, then I would like our presenters to answer questions and comment on comments. Patrick.
Okay. Right. So, Deborah, I think you made 2 points. One was you wondered whether, if I understood this correctly, some of Malinowski's descendants, that what I described could be found in any family, and I think, or yes, and I think that's true. Yes, and why make such a big deal of it is one thing one could say. But you asked if, I think, if I understood this correctly, that because Malinowski was famous, it's easier to sort of make
Maybe
this
sort
out of the
blame him or yeah.
blame him for, yes. Yes, I think that may well be so. But then you also made the point about, or a second point about, I think you were saying that I was implying that if I had the chance to talk to my mother more, that I would have got her to admit that really Malinowski was, you know, a terrible person.
Well, I kind of picked up a little elements of that.
Yeah,
maybe
yeah. I think based on what she did write and what she did say, and also what she said to me in private conversations, I kind of think that there was I think there was an element in all her life actually of controlling her response to the world. I mean, we all do that, of course, but maybe a bit more in her than I'm not sure. But perhaps perhaps I assume too much, you know. I have to say I have a rather ambivalent attitude towards my cousins. On this matter, I rather admire their, you know, throw it all out on the table and this is how I feel about the world approach. And on the other hand, I think I'm rather English about it. I think, you know, really should just, you know, keep it to yourselves. But and I think Grażyna, yes, I mean, she was a good researcher and did sort of, for whatever reason, she didn't allow too obviously her, whatever her personal feelings were, to intrude. And I mean, I don't have much more to say about that. I think I need to think about those points. Yeah, Audrey Richards, I was surprised when I read that. I didn't know that. That was, but it is interesting, isn't it, that they were aware enough of, I guess, of Malinowski's shortcomings, and you know, as a practical father, and of the need for a practical mother figure, for them to want her to be a stepmother. And I knew Audrey later when I was young and she was quite old, but I'd have been very happy to have had her as a stepmother.
Absolutely. But frightening.
Yeah, she was. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, then Anna, please.
Thank you very much for your comments. Yes, first I will answer Professor Posern-Zieliński. You touched a question which is, I think, impossible to answer. For all these years of my study on Obrębski, I have still going on discussions with you, with Marcin Lubaś, with late Professor Halpern at Amherst on this question: why Obrębski didn't find his place in the American academia. And I think part of an answer can be such that he left Europe as a European intellectual and a European professor. He was professor of Łódź University and of Warsaw University. And the American academic system was completely different from the European one. And in 1955, when Obrębski quit his job in the United Nations, in the trusteeship department, he was already 54 years old. And he was too old to start academic career in the United States. And Obrębski's son, Stefan, told me that this incompatibility of Obrębski's mental frame and the American anthropological system, academic system, was so big that this gap was impossible to cross. And that's why he had those jobs in the second rank colleges. And he was very disappointed with American students. And he also, for all his life, had problems with publishing. He was perfectionist. He wrote and wrote and wrote and never finished. So this is a part of an answer, but of course not full answer. And as far as Jamaica is concerned, yes, of course, it's true with those economic sheets and so on, but on the other hand, he worked on Malinowski-like monographs. There are monographs on religion in Jamaica, on family letters in Jamaica, also manuscripts, long manuscripts, which are not completed. They are in the Amherst archives. So it's more complex, I think. The picture is still more complex than we perhaps know today. And thank you, Adam, for your comment. I think that Obrębski was the first one, and for a long time the only one, who introduced the new ethnography of European village in Slavic Europe. Yes, because Ireland and later Portugal, it started to develop in Western Europe. But in Slavic Europe, he was a precursor and really the only one for a long time. Thank you.
Professor Posern-Zieliński.
Thank you very much for all comments. I would, especially for comments about Obrębski's biographical, let's say, elements of his life. So I agree that there are some papers, but never published in his archive. Probably written on the side, not as a duty to the project. But even in, I know this text, but even in this text, regardless the topic, that it is a religion and society and family, is not such a, let's say, spirit of typical spirit of the field work of Obrębski, typical for his work in Balkan area. Anyway, no, it's a hidden question, and regarding your comments, Professor Cooper. Probably much better we will know Malinowski's Oaxaca activity project today in the 5th session. My colleague Kozłowski will talk about this. I would not like to, to repeat the same. I only think that it's worth to point out that Juan de la Fuente, this associate of Malinowski, I was just wondering why Juan de la Fuente, who came after the after combined work with Malinowski, came back to Mexico, and in a couple of years he just high-rocketed to the highest position between anthropology and government. He became a scientific director of the major institute of Indian integration and acculturation in Instituto Indigenista Mexicano in Mexico Ciudad, and wrote a couple of books, even on Oaxaca. So I grabbed these books, looking to if I could find any references, strict references, or just, you know, some suggestions of the idea of Malinowski. Nothing of that type, nothing. Only a few quotations of minor importance. And in another book, I found such a very striking information. Juan de la Fuente, okay, in a polite way, but he accused Malinowski that it's not true that the academia, the world anthropology, identify Malinowski's as author of the concept of practical anthropology, because really the practical anthropology is was the concept of practical anthropology was developed by Manuel Gamio, a Mexican anthropologist who came to London School of Economics during the stay of Malinowski. They discussed this problem, and Malinowski took from Gamio this idea, put in own text, and it is not true. It is a proof of this argumentation, Juan de la Fuente, and it's out of question, gave the information about the absolutely accelerating development of applied anthropology in Latin America. Really speaking, we can now say that there's no difference between, let's say, anthropology and applied anthropology. Anthropology must be in Latin America applied anthropology. So just when I came first time to Latin America, I was struck by the name of the anthropology. On one side, they borrow a lot of ideas from the United States, so from cultural anthropology, but they don't use the name absolutely cultural anthropology, they use antropología social. And I was thinking that, okay, antropología social, social anthropology is a concept may be derived from Malinowski or from British anthropology. Nothing of this way of thinking. They use the name Antropología Social, social anthropology, for another reason, because this is anthropology socially engaged only. Mm-hmm. That's the reason that they use the Antropología Social. It's nothing with in connection with the British anthropology. So,
if I just say one thing about that's very interesting. But of course, Gamio was pupil of Boas. In 1910, Boas comes to Mexico City and becomes a visiting director of this project, and he gets Gamio to do this archaeological reconstruction of the Aztec city and so on. And in a way, of course, Gamio becomes also a major player in the whole Republican mestizo ideology in Mexico. So you could say this all comes from Boas, really, rather than Malinowski, into Mexican anthropology. That's the genealogy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Deborah, please. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you very much for comments. Yeah, so it's interesting how, Adam, you mentioned the whole Fortes element here, And if we're going to start concentrating on households, which is what de l'Histoire is trying to do, in a sense that takes a little bit of the emphasis away from how these households interconnect in order to kind of create a livelihood. And I suppose we've got to think of how Fortes was this sort of quintessential descent theorist rather than an alliance theorist. And of course, the alliance theorist really took their inspiration, I suppose, from Malinowski in the first place, creating these webs of connection that, you know, relate different households to each other. So it goes back a long way. But I suppose I was thinking as well that had Fortes sort of embedded his insights into a slightly more compelling way of writing, because I mean, I had a friend who used to take Fortes to bed with him to put him to sleep because of the way, this stodgy way that Fortes wrote his two great big volumes, whereas and Malinowski is avowedly much more interesting to read in a sense. Perhaps we would have had a very much more Fortes-oriented view of all these phenomena. But thank you for your points as well about this whole question of non-economic and economic. I think this is an abiding issue, and it's quite interesting to hear about how these debates were taking shape back at the sort of early years of the 20th century and in mainstream economic journals rather than in sort of anthropology journals, as it were. And so I suppose what interests me there is the way that Malinowski's ideas were then taken up by Moos and then became the basis of this whole set of ideas, including by Gudeman and others, on what the relationship between what you might call the contract or the market is on the one hand, and the sort of non-market or the non-market elements in the contract, which is how some have put, you know, the notion of the gift. So in other words, it's not a matter of moving from a society dominated by gift and reciprocity into a society dominated by contract, but rather that the two of them somehow interact in different ways at different points, despite the best efforts of economists to pretend that there is no non-contractual element in the contract. So it's an ongoing debate and one which will never be solved, but still, I think, very much worth considering and debating. And finally, also in relation to what you said about how it's, you've heard us talk a lot about dualities. He's either this or he's that. He's either an imperialist or isn't. Here I find Freddie Fox's idea quite compelling, which is he is both and. He is not either an imperialist or a cultural relativist. He is both of these things, or was both of these things. And Fox talks about the fact that the people who have been critical of Malinowski for his imperialist, they call it sort of mind cast or whatever, have tended to look in the micro level of the sort of relationships that he had with the natives in his field site. But he also suggests it's worth looking at the meso level, the kinds of pronouncements he made about things, in this case, this commission that he was participating in Australia, about the use of plantation labor. This was more policy-oriented thing, and he had, you know, it was not a straightforwardly imperialist position by any means. It was a protectionist one. It was a trusteeship-oriented one, and sometimes had some uncomfortable echoes of the way that apartheid system worked out in South Africa, which is, yes, keep everyone bounded in their own little world, do not have them modernized, do not have them move into labor, etc. So even that had its own contradictions. But I think thinking both and is probably better than thinking either or in the case of Malinowski and many other people as well.
Thank you. We just finished the first session. Thank you. And here is coffee waiting. So yeah, and then remember that, you know, we will have two parallel sessions. One is in here and the other one is downstairs where we had lunch yesterday. Thank you.